All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Getting Through Coronavirus Explained. I'm Matt Levin, housing and data reporter with CalMatters. This is the latest in a series of live events that CalMatters is putting on, where reporters like myself ask leading policymakers and experts for practical advice on how you can get through what are truly unprecedented times in California. Some recent ones we've done include how to hopefully get your unemployment benefits without tearing your hair out, how to maintain your mental health while you're cooped up in your home, and how to help your kids with distance learning. All of these Getting Through Coronavirus explainers are available on our YouTube page. Just go to YouTube and search CalMatters. They're also on our podcast hub. So, whatever podcast platform you typically use to listen to your favorite podcast, again, search CalMatters, and all of these are there as well. One more plug before we actually start. You can keep track of these events and all of our coverage of statewide issues by signing up for our newsletter, What Matters, which comes out every morning. Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf says she reads What Matters top to bottom every morning. So if you want to be like Libby Schaaf, recommend you sign up. And if you can't afford it, we recommend that you become a CalMatters donor. Now is a really tough time for journalism organizations across the country. Arguably, the work we're doing has never been more important. So if you can, please donate in whatever amount you feel comfortable with, and subscribe to your local newspapers as well. Reporters need your help. Okay, let's talk about what we came to talk about today, which is what help is available for homeowners, renters, and homeless Californians struggling amid the COVID-19 pandemic. California had a housing crisis well before coronavirus hit. And unfortunately, in many ways, it's now worse, with millions of Californians filing for unemployment and millions more wondering if their next paycheck will actually materialize. Californians are increasingly asking themselves versions of the following three questions. One, how am I going to meet my mortgage payment? Two, how am I going to meet my rent? And three, what are we going to do about the more than 150,000 Californians who can't shelter in place because they're homeless? So luckily, we have three experts to help answer those questions and others. We have Lisa Sitkin, who's a senior staff attorney at the National Housing Law Project. Sasha Harnden, a housing policy advocate at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. And Tomiquia Moss, founder and chief executive of All Home, an organization based in the Bay Area that works to advance solutions for extremely low-income Californians and those experiencing homelessness. Thanks for coming on, you guys. We want to give this conversation a really practical lens to it. We want specific, actionable advice for average Californians trying to get through a really trying time. For those of you that are watching right now, if you have questions about your specific situation or your friend's situation or a relative situation, ask them in the chat. I will be going through some of those questions as we proceed with this webinar. And we also have a social media team that's monitoring the chat, and they will provide you with links and other resources that may answer some of the questions that we don't discuss here. Okay, I know that was a mouthful. Let's start, and we'll start with one of my questions. Lisa, let's start with you. If I'm a homeowner and I'm worried about not being able to make my mortgage payment next month, what is the first thing I should do?
Well, this may be a little bit of a surprising answer, but the first thing you should do is think really hard about whether you can or cannot pay it, because there is assistance available that we're going to talk about more today, but it's not necessarily simple or straightforward to get, even though some of it is supposed to be. And the consequences later of taking advantage of the assistance that's available can come back to bite people. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what things are going to look like down the road. So really the first thing to do is to take a hard look at your budget, at your situation. For some people, this will be quick because you lost your job and you don't have income. That's a no-brainer. But for other people, if there's rearranging in your budget you can do to absolutely prioritize the mortgage payment, I would strongly advise you to do that. Once you've done that, and I'm just going to add a 1A or 2, is at that point you want to determine what kind of loan you have. And we've provided some resources that I think are being shared on this to determine what kind of loan you have, because that will, to some extent, dictate what kind of assistance is available to you.
Sasha, a similar version of the same question. May 1st is coming up in 8 days. If I'm a renter and I am concerned that I'm not going to be able to make my May 1st rent payment, what's the first thing I should do?
Sure. And this may sound familiar. So I think that the most important piece of advice that I have here is, again, try to pay if you can. That's going to be an individual determination based on, all of the needs that you have in your household, your income, all of those things. But right now, there is no protection in place that says that anyone is relieved from the obligation to pay rent. There are a variety of protections that have been put in place by local jurisdictions, through some federal programs, through our state courts. But it's really important that people know that none of those forgives the obligation to pay rent. It may provide sort of a pause in terms of whether or not you can be evicted for not paying that rent. But as of yet, we do not have sort of a policy solution to what happens with all of that unpaid rent. We know that 1/3 of folks were unable to pay in April, and we expect that to be even greater this coming month. So if you know that you can't afford your rent, the best thing to do is to notify your landlord in writing as soon as you can, and preferably before it's due. The different local protections and state protections and some of the things that the governor has included in his orders sort of treat this notification requirement a little bit differently. But the most protective thing to do is let the landlord know in writing beforehand. Keep all the correspondence with your landlord and keep any documents that you have related to a loss of income, related to COVID. And then I think once you've taken those sort of practical steps, that should give you some breathing room and some time to go out and seek assistance from a local legal aid program or another legal organization that can advise you about your specific rights, because there are so many variations in terms of what local protections are in place, county by county, city by city. It's really important to figure out, what applies to your specific situation.
And just to reiterate there is no statewide rent forgiveness as of right now, which is something I've seen brewing up on Twitter every now and then, but nothing like that has happened so far.
That's correct. There is no statewide rent forgiveness, and there is no statewide moratorium on evictions. Landlords can still serve notices on tenants, and they can still file an eviction case in court. Luckily, the state courts have really stepped up to recognize this is not a time we should be pushing people into courthouses and out of their homes. And so there is an emergency rule in place that should cut off the process at that point. So people should know that in most situations, unless there's a threat to health and safety, they will not be sort of summarily removed from their homes, and they have the time to seek out that legal assistance.
Tomiquia, it's actually been really heartening. I've done some stories on people who are homeless who are trying to find emergency housing right now. Some of these hotels and motels we keep hearing about. And whenever one of these stories publishes, I typically get emails from average readers saying, we would love to help in some way, our unhoused neighbors, but we don't know how because we're being told to stay at home. So do you have any guidance on that? What's the best way for kind of your average Californian to help people who are homeless right now?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, if you're in a position in your personal finances to be able to support folks who are unsheltered during this time, that's amazing. And what's been great is that there have been relief funds set up throughout the entire state of California, everything from organizations, philanthropy have come together to really support very basic needs that people who are unhoused have. And so there are relief funds set up throughout the state that people can donate to right now. And those dollars go directly to nonprofit organizations who are supporting our unhoused neighbors during this time. Those dollars go for rental assistance, they go for emergency supplies. And so if you're interested in and you have the means to be able to support financially, it's a great way to get involved. And there's really a direct link to those resources going back out into the hands of people who need them and getting those dollars to work really quickly. There's also a lot of folks who are donating supplies and emergency supplies and other sorts of resources that organizations like shelters and transitional housing programs need right now. So if you have hand sanitizers and masks and things like that, people have been so incredible and generous in donating those directly to nonprofits in communities throughout the state. So that's a really amazing way to lend your support. We also have folks who are making meals for people who are unable to leave their homes, people who are in shelters, working with those providers to provide food access during this time for unhoused people is incredibly acute. We have a lot of our affordable housing providers who provide housing for people who are formerly homeless, who had congregate kitchens, who are no longer able to cook. And so meal programs are being set up throughout the state, and regular Californians who want to provide food assistance to folks. There are definitely ways to plug in your local communities to be able to provide food to people who need it. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, we also have a blood shortage. We have people who are donating blood, and that has been super helpful. If you don't get squeamish by needles and you are able to do that, that's a really amazing resource for our first responders and folks who are unhoused. And I think, our cities and counties and the state are doing an incredible job of prioritizing our most vulnerable residents who are unsheltered to get into the hotels and motels that are being procured across the state with emphasis on their health priorities. And so I think it has proven to be an incredible resource for organizations who work with folks to be able to use those assets in a meaningful way.
Are there supplies and materials beyond PPE that shelters and homeless service providers now could use, I guess, more than ever?
Yes, cleaning supplies. I used to run a family shelter in San Francisco, and we would get bulk cleaning supplies from our distributors. And those supply chains have been disrupted through the COVID-19 crisis. So many of the providers who are, doing those emergency services don't have access to cleaning supplies in bulk. And so toiletries, all hand sanitizers, gloves, all of those kinds of things to keep the physical spaces clean and safe and accessible. I think the cities and counties are adding hand washing stations to the encampment sites and other places throughout our communities where people are actually outdoors. All of those things are necessary and helpful in this crisis.
Go ahead, Sasha.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things. I think there's, so many ways that people can help right now. And if you're unable to help financially or through donations, time is a really valuable resource. We have a lot of organizations that need extra help right now, either because their workforce is impacted or because they are setting up these funds and they could use volunteers to help administer those funds. I know one program that we work with, I think, had set up a $10 million fund for rental assistance that ran out in 3 days. And so the the volume of calls that are being placed upon, the organizations that provide these services to our most vulnerable residents. And I think the other thing that is really important is for folks, if they are concerned about these issues, to let their local policymakers know. There are so many competing priorities for city councils to be grappling with, for state representatives, and it's really important to convey just the scope and the scale of the need here in terms of policy solutions to make sure that we can weather this storm.
And Sasha, if I could just add to that point, I think I was trying to really think about the sort of emergency needs right now, but that last point that you made around making sure that the policymakers are aware of the needs of these communities is not only critical in this moment, but the fight is even more necessary to ensure that we are really thinking about how do we provide long-term housing solutions for people who are experiencing homelessness throughout our state. And this opportunity of this emergency creates future opportunities for policymakers to keep this issue front and center. So I really appreciate that point.
Lisa, I wanted to talk about what help specifically would be available for people who are worried about their next mortgage payment. There was some help for mortgage holders in the CARES Act, the federal stimulus package. What exactly was in that and who qualifies for it, which I think is probably even the more important question.
I'll start with that question. So who qualifies for it is someone who has a mortgage that is defined as federally backed. A federally backed mortgage loan is the category that the CARES Act reaches with respect to individual homeowners. And what that means is that you have a loan that is owned or insured or backed in some way by a federal agency. And not to get too far into the alphabet soup, but basically that means FHA, which is where a lot of first-time homeowner and lower-income homeowner loans get made, are insured by the FHA. That also includes reverse mortgages for seniors. Also the VA, so Veterans Administration loans, rural housing service loans. So actually many people don't know that the Department of Agriculture has single family loan programs. They're smaller than others, but it does reach many people in rural communities. And then the biggest part is loans that are owned or backed by either Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which are two entities that kind of serve to finance a lot of our mortgage market. And so have this connection to those loans. So people with those loans, which nationally is about 70% of all single family loans, they are covered by the CARES Act. And what the CARES Act says is for those people, if they contact their mortgage servicer, and the servicer is the company that you pay your monthly payment to, sometimes that's different from who owns your loan, and there's some complications there, but if you contact them and you affirm that you are experiencing a financial hardship that is due to this emergency, and that can be due directly or indirectly. It doesn't mean you have to have a COVID diagnosis or you necessarily have to have lost your job. You could have cut hours, you could have changes in your household composition and increased expenses from childcare. Many, many different ways that people are being impacted financially by this emergency. And all of them come under this umbrella. It's supposed to be broad. So if you advise your servicer of that, they are then supposed to agree to either reduce or actually waive for the time being, temporarily, your mortgage payments for a certain period of time. And mostly what we're seeing is that people who are asking, even though the CARES Act says you can initially get up to 180 days or 6 months of this assistance, most people, I think, are initially getting 90 days, which is then renewable later. And then after that first 180 days, because we don't know how long this all is going to last, you can actually get up to an additional 180 days. So it's trying to cast a broad net into the future and also into the kinds of hardships people have. And I just want to explain that like the rent that Sasha was talking about, this is not a program that in any way forgives those mortgage payments. It is a temporary deferral of your payments, meaning that while you will not be marked as late or charged late fees or hopefully dinged on your credit, there are protections for that in the Act as well, you will still owe this money. And so the part of the reason I said earlier that if you can pay, you should pay, is that this is not, a forgiveness of that debt that you owe. It's sort of kicking it down the road. And because the CARES Act actually doesn't have rules about what happens at the end of the forbearance, what the lender can and can't do or demand of you in terms of repaying that, there are complications there, there's uncertainty there. And I just am concerned that people go into this really with their eyes wide open. If they're going to need and take advantage of it, that's fine. But you need to understand that you're not saying goodbye to those payments. They're going to come back.
Real quickly, how would I know if my mortgage is, let's say, backed by Fannie and Freddie or Freddie?
So Fannie and Freddie, Fannie and Freddie, as we call them, conveniently do have online loan lookup tools where if you put in the address and usually the last 4 digits of your social security number, you can find if there's a match in their portfolio. And those links are provided in some of the materials that I gave your producer. So I assume that they're going to be making the rounds here. Our website, nhlp.org, also has those in our COVID resources, so people can look there as well. But for some of the other kinds of loans, the FHA and VA, many people know if they have those, but if you don't know, you can check with your servicer. You can also check your loan documents. There are some guidance that I give in the piece I put together on our website that kind of gives clues for how you would know if you have one of those loans.
So I want to ask one of our first audience questions, which actually came ahead of our webinar today, which is please address ideas for assisting mortgage holders who don't have a federally backed loan. This reader also asked, I'm having private landlords calling asking about any financial relief they could qualify for, since some depend on their rentals not only to pay mortgages, but for their income. So what about that population, that other 30% that don't have a federally backed mortgage?
Well, I will jump ahead a tiny bit and just say that policy advocates, consumer advocates around the country are pushing hard for a next round of CARES Act, or whatever they're going to call the next piece of legislation, for this to be broadened to cover everybody. But at this point, that's not what we have. So what I would say is that these forbearances, the idea of when you're having a temporary financial hardship, having a break for a period of time at least on your payments, that's not a new thing that just came about because of the CARES Act. So most servicers already would do things like that for unemployment, for certain kinds of medical emergencies and things like that. So it's not that those 30% are completely out of options. In all cases, federally backed or not, you do need to make contact with your loan servicer to figure out what they're offering. But many of those people who are in the non-federally backed category should still be able to get some form of assistance. It may be a shorter forbearance in some cases because the timeline isn't mandated in the same way. But I'm hearing that people are getting 60, 90 days to start and able to go back. There are certainly, I'm also hearing people getting told the investor of your loan won't allow this. And I would say not that 100% of people are going to be able to get forbearances, but it's worth pushing back and exploring what the options are and asking questions. And I think that it's worth mentioning as well that the state, the administration, Newsom administration, did extract some commitments from a number of the big national banks and from many state chartered financial institutions. I've provided some information on that too, so there should be a link available. And those agreements do go beyond the corners of the CARES Act, because those institutions, many of those big banks, service both federally backed and non-federally backed. The agreements don't have quite the teeth or the reach that I would have liked to see, but the agreement in basic terms was to give people up to 90 days, so that could be less, of this kind of payment relief, to hold off on doing foreclosures, which the CARES Act also requires for at least the next month or so, or 3 weeks, I think we have left. And also to, work with people to extend that if it's needed later on. So the reality for people who aren't covered by the CARES Act is they can probably still get assistance, but it may look a little bit different in terms of the length and also in terms of what you have to provide to qualify. As I said, the CARES Act only requires that you say, I'm having this COVID-related hardship. In the agreement, my understanding is that the servicers can still ask for some documentation, which can be difficult for some people to provide, but it means that it is important to sort of gather together before you make contact information that demonstrates the financial hardship that you're having in case that is required of you.
Sasha, a live reader question here, which I think is a good one. Just for a bit of background, the Judicial Council, which is kind of the body that oversees the court system in California, has basically suspended the vast majority of eviction proceedings throughout the state, with the exception of evictions because of public health and safety issues. So this reader or viewer asks, what public health and safety issues would allow an eviction to go forward?
That's a good question. And the short answer is that was not spelled out by the emergency rule. It's going to come down to a sort of situation by situation determination. And that's a determination that, we've interpreted the emergency rule as requiring that determination to be made by the court. So that is not, sort of a box that the landlord checks when they file. It really needs to be a fact specific determination that's made on the record by the court. We basically interpret that as requiring the landlord to file a motion in order to be heard by a judge and sort of move forward with that case. So it really should be limited. This is not something that addresses, playing your stereo too loud or something like that. This should be a concrete and specific sort of physical threat to the health and safety of the residents of that building.
So this viewer also asks, if a unit is condemnable, would that qualify?
Again, I think that's going to come down to really the specifics of the situation. What are the the conditions in that building? It's hard to answer that question without knowing more, because it could be about a specific unit, the entire building. There's a big range of sort of code enforcement type conditions. Typically, when those get bad enough that really the building needs to be vacated for health and safety, that's going to be a determination made by a city. They would what we call red tag that building. And so I think short of that happening, a landlord probably can't use just sort of, the fact that the building hasn't been maintained or something like that as an excuse to evict people.
Tomiquia, another question we got in advance of our webinar. There's been some frustration, I'm paraphrasing here, that local governments are kind of taking their time to get these hotels and motels up and operational. Why is it taking more time after a hotel or motel has been acquired for them to actually be up and running and getting people off the streets into rooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we're hearing from our local and county partners is that the delay is really about staffing of the hotels. When the hotels are used for the health crisis emergency, then you have the health department sort of negotiating with the hotel owners, with the leases and the sort of operations of those hotels. But if the hotels are not procured by the health department or the county, and local nonprofits are operating those buildings, we need to actually have adequate staff to make sure that the people brought into the hotels are safe. And that has to do, and these are guidelines that were put out by the health department in terms of who's prioritized for the hotels and motels. But we've heard very specifically that the delay is really about making sure that there's enough on-site case management and staff support to support the people who are being brought into the hotels and motels. There's also just a general staffing capacity across the entire emergency response ecosystem to make sure that we have frontline staff to be able to support our folks who are experiencing homelessness. So we've been trying to get creative with jurisdictions all around the Bay Area about how to ensure that the most vulnerable folks are brought into the hotels and motels as quickly as possible, but that they're able to be safe and we're able to maintain the health guidelines within those hotels and motels, in addition to meals and staffing support that you would need to operate a temporary facility like that.
So there's been some pushback within some communities, particularly in Southern California, about people who are homeless, who have tested positive or are symptomatic, moving into nearby hotels. And a lot of the opposition comes from a place of what is preventing those residents of those hotels from growing out into the broader community. And so I'm wondering what protocols you may know of that are in place to minimize maybe, or at least allay some of those fears, or whether those fears are well-founded in the first place.
No, I think it's a valid question. Based on our work across the Bay Area, we really see the health departments who are managing those hotels really stepping up and ensuring that that the residents of those hotels have the supports and safety requirements, frankly, that they need in this public health crisis. And so my understanding is if you have tested positive, that you're being quarantined, that all of the health, the sort of state regulated, county regulated requirements are being upheld in those buildings. And so we really want to encourage folks who are coming into those hotels to, abide by the requirements that have been laid out in our public health guidelines, because it also is not just about their own personal safety, but the safety around them. And so, certainly, if folks want to leave the hotels when they're medically compromised, I'm certain that the health department and their staff have guidelines around how to support people to stay safe in those hotels and motels. So we've not really heard that is a primary concern for a lot of the community-based organizations who are helping the health department run those buildings, but I think it's a valid question.
Lisa, kind of back to you. You were kind of referring to the possibility of the federal government doing more for homeowners, maybe in another round of legislation. It seems to me that if I'm a homeowner and I'm, debating how much of my next mortgage payment to make, like a lot of it is going to depend on whether I believe they're going to do something, whether Congress is going to do something later, right? Whether they're going to allow me to reduce some of the payments that I couldn't make down the road. Do you expect the federal government to do something significant again? I mean, if so, what would that look like?
So the first thing I would say is I do not expect that any future action will involve forgiving or reducing the payments that are due. I think the best that we can hope for and what we are trying to push for is more kind of guardrails and requirements, particularly regarding demands that somebody pay all of those missed payments as one lump sum at the end of the forbearance, which for most people is a completely unrealistic, it's an absurd thing to even contemplate. But many people, unfortunately, are being told when they ask for these that that's what they might face. And it's true, that is what they might face. In most cases, other arrangements can be worked out to stretch it over time, add it to the back of the loan. There are a lot of sort of bells and whistles to how that can work. But we would like to see a prohibition on demands, unless someone is actually able to afford that and chooses to just reinstate with a lump sum, which, as I said, is going to be impossible for so many people who are needing and taking advantage now of this assistance. So that's the kind of thing that I would expect to see. And what I would say is, I don't think that that's necessarily going to change depending on whether you got your forbearance before that happened or after. So if you need a forbearance now, I mean, I know I said pay your mortgage if you can, which is the first cut. But the second thing is, if you can't pay your mortgage, do try to get a forbearance, because then you won't see it, hitting your credit. Then you won't see late fees and certain kinds of delinquency demands. It's just a better position to be in if you can't pay, or if you can't pay the full amount, to actually have that agreement worked out. So I don't want to be, discouraging people who really do need this help now from getting that with promises of what might come later. I don't think that that's necessarily the way to gamble here. If you need the help, you should contact your servicer and find out what they're offering, and try to get, into an arrangement sooner rather than later, so that you're not having unagreed upon delinquent payments racking up.
A quick question for you, Lisa, from a viewer. We are currently in the process of refinancing our mortgage to lower our monthly payment. Will we be eligible to apply for a forbearance plan with the new lender?
So that's going to depend on who the lender is, and also on some of these complexities of the mortgage market, whether they are selling it on to a secondary market and how that market is going to treat it. I will say that just this week, Fannie and Freddie, who are a big part of that secondary market, announced that they will accept loans that are in forbearance. So that would be like somebody's new refinance. If somebody refinanced, then needed the help, the lender is still going to have the assurance now of knowing that Fannie and Freddie, if that's where they want to sell it, would take the loan into one of their pools. But that's not going to be every lender and every loan that's going on that path. So we definitely have seen some, seizing up of credit a little bit, and interruptions of people's attempts to refinance and do things, which of course, with the interest rate, what they are, people want to be able to do that if they can. So it is going to be, to some extent, very dependent on the specifics of your transaction and kind of where that loan is supposed to land afterwards. Gotcha.
So maybe if you have a current federally backed mortgage and you're refinancing, double check to see that the refinancing source, also be eligible for some of these federal provisions.
Mm-hmm.
Sasha, a couple other really good renter questions for you from a viewer. Are there protections for those who want to terminate or get out of their lease due to fear of not being able to pay back housing debt after the pandemic is lifted?
That is a good question. There may be some provisions around sort of lease termination in some of the local protections. And we have a link to some resources, I believe, that we included as well on our website for sort of how to look up your local protections. I don't believe that any of the sort of statewide things that have dealt with evictions to date include anything around terminating a lease. I believe that some of the local protections may have the sort of opposite provision, which says that even if your lease expires right now, you're basically allowed to sort of keep paying rent and stay, which is really important. We don't want people being pushed out of their homes right now, in large part because leasing offices are closed right now. It's very hard to find new housing. And so I would really caution people against sort of getting spooked and moving out. I think it's far more advisable to really try to talk to your landlord, see what's possible, what can be worked out, and talk to your neighbors. I think, organized tenants, there is strength in numbers. And if you know that your entire building is facing a similar situation, it might be time to have a conversation with the landlord collectively about, what you can work out to make sure that the landlord is made whole, but the tenants are able to sort of weather the storm and stay housed.
And another viewer question: do all of the eviction protections regarding renters apply to trailer parks as well? My friend who rents a space in one got a 60-day notice to pay, or they'll start lien proceedings on her trailer.
I don't know specifically about the issue of liens.
Okay.
But in terms of the basic eviction protections at the courts, I believe that those also apply to mobile homes.
And Lisa, it seems like you wanted to chime in.
Yes. So the thing when somebody has a mobile home is that there are sort of two transactions or deals that somebody is involved in. So there is the space rental where in the park where the mobile home lives. And that is a tenant landlord kind of a relationship. And, so that would be dealt with in terms of evictions, in terms of what the court is and isn't doing now. But when you mentioned a lien and making the payment, it makes me think that this may be related to the mortgage or the loan that the person has that they use to finance the purchase of this mobile home. And in that case, currently, the CARES Act does not reach those mobile home loans. That's another area that we're trying to make sure it gets expanded to cover. And while I think that that there's some creative lawyering that could be done to protect people from repossessions, which it's a little bit different procedure than a foreclosure of a house, but of a mobile home right now, we don't have a sort of COVID emergency relief framework that has been put in place for that particular group of homeowners. So they really should contact local legal services if they're able to get some guidance and some advice on what to do in terms of dealing with the lender in that situation. And one creative kind of argument I'm seeing come up a little bit in the foreclosure context is to point out that repossessing a mobile home, somebody's home, probably is not an essential business function right now. And so the physical actions that might have to be taken to do that probably violate the governor's order, the stay-at-home order. So that's one kind of argument that I think people are going to probably be making or have already started making, and I think it's valid.
And Tomiquia, you wanted to chime in as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to lift up the point that Sasha was making around sort of the goal really is to keep people in their homes. We are really working on the rental assistance piece, both at the federal level and at the state level, because prior to COVID, for every person that gets housed, 3 more would become homeless during the same period of time. So we already had a conflation of more and more people falling into homelessness because of economic hardships, and those who were housed doubled and tripled up. Those households are incredibly vulnerable during this time and really require financial assistance and rental assistance to ensure that they don't lose the precarious housing that they were already holding on to, let alone those of our neighbors who are already unhoused. So I think it's really important to look at the sort of continuum of needs so that we ensure that the resources are going to stabilize the bottom as much as we possibly can, because more folks, who 9.9 million of our fellow Americans, are impacted by this economic crisis, and it's going to disproportionately hit the bottom third. And so we want to make sure that rental assistance is a primary focus for policymakers across the region, the state, and the country.
Well, that's a perfect segue, Tomiquia, to another reader question, which I think is in the back of a lot of Californians' minds. Is there a plan after the hotels and motels stop housing people who are homeless? And I'll just add this, if there isn't, what should that plan be in your mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of us in the space are thinking about this very thing. We don't want folks who are currently in those motels and hotels to go back to the streets. So we are actively working with our state partners, with the administration and other community-based organizations to really think through what are the right strategies to make sure that there are permanent exits for those folks into permanent housing. And we had a housing shortage, as you mentioned at the top of the call, or at the top of the webinar before this crisis. So it just is more acute, and we need to be paying attention to the exit strategies for permanent housing for the folks who are currently in the hotels and motels. The other piece is we are evaluating, the governor has taken incredible leadership on Project Room Key, of working with the hotel and motel owners to secure more rooms during this health crisis. And not all of those hotels will be able to be converted into permanent assets. Hotel and motel owners may not want to sell. So it is really a piece of the broader housing strategy. And I think Sasha referenced this early on. We have to actually be thinking about all avenues for allowing housing production, whether it's modular housing, whether it's permitting and zoning, all of the regulatory and production opportunities that we have really being unleashed during this time to meet the need. And I think we see the hotels and motels as a piece of a housing option that could be folded in where appropriate, if the typology fits, a supportive housing model, for example. Do they have kitchenettes? Is there one point of entry? So there's a lot of sort of technical elements that need to be considered in terms of whether or not the actual asset can be converted, as well as really leveraging the capital dollars that are coming in from the federal government in terms of emergency relief, but also how do we leverage operational dollars if our affordable housing nonprofits or community-based organizations are going to operate these assets long-term. They need to be able to have commensurate services and operation dollars to subsidize the work. And so we see this as a more comprehensive opportunity to look at the full suite of housing solutions and put together some of our best thinking for our policymakers to consider. So we're hard at work at All Home doing that.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because the governor kind of made a big deal of this Motel 6 agreement, which there were dozens of Motel 6s across the state that have engaged in some type of agreement with the state to provide emergency homeless housing, and also said, hey, we'd be open to you just taking over these properties, period. The question in my mind was, well, can a Motel 6 be easily converted into homeless housing that's more permanent? When I think of permanent supportive housing, for example, those are essentially apartment units most of the time, right? There are something else besides a Motel 6. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it really depends on the sort of layout of the property.
Yeah.
There are many developers, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, Mercy Housing, who have done acquisition rehab, Eden housing, right, with a single room occupancy hotel type of units. But we're trying to do an evaluation and analysis of the actual assets to really assess relative to what we've been able to acquire through the health crisis, what percentage of that is really viable for long term, and frankly, is it cost effective? If we can't get a bulk sort of solution, either on the capital side or operations and services side, that allows that to be cost effective versus a new construction supportive housing site, that's the kind of evaluation that we're doing right now. So we want to make sure that where we can, and there are jurisdictions who are already thinking about this, that they're working with motel and hotel owners to acquire those buildings. They want to be a part of the solution, and the mix works, the building typology works, and other communities where these will revert back to their original uses. So we're doing that evaluation right now to see what's the scale and scope we're talking about, and not wanting to overpromise that this is the wholesale response to addressing homelessness in our state. We actually have a housing shortage, and we need to be building and preserving housing for people with extremely low incomes. And that is a lot of people in our state. And right now, we don't really have a financing tool to build housing at that scale that allows, more than really, more than a third of the people who are unsheltered in our state have incomes and are working and just need housing that they can afford. So we really want to see this as an opportunity to look at the solution set more broadly.
Sasha, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of piggyback off of that and just really hammer that point home about, unleashing the tools that we have to make sure that we meet the need for the most vulnerable. And, we know that we already had a housing crisis. We know that we have some of the highest poverty in the country when you take housing costs into account. I think 25% of children in California are living in poverty when you factor in housing. And so we know that every tool that we have available to us really needs to be kind of doubled down on and directed towards producing the affordable housing that we know we're going to need even more of. We had a shortage to begin with before this crisis. Now, with a third of renters unable to make rent, with all of the layoffs, I don't know how many millions of people have applied for unemployment insurance. We need to recognize that there isn't some sort of invisible stream of renters who are flush with cash who can just be sort of, switched out for the ones who can't make rent. This is affecting all of us. And so it's going to be really important that we direct all of the incentives that we have, through our land use laws, that all of those things that convey value on development are really sort of pushed and directed towards affordable housing and towards producing the units that we need for that extremely low and very low income populations that currently really don't have any sort of statewide, comprehensive program to produce those units and to subsidize those people's rent payments.
And those units are often very expensive to build in certain parts of the state. Another renter question for you, Sasha, that I think is incredibly important. You mentioned the eviction moratorium. What happens when the state of emergency is over and people are unable to pay several months of back rent? I think this is the most important question for tenants right now.
Right. And I think the sort of short answer is we haven't answered that question yet. There's a lot of work that's left to be done. We've been working to sort of prepare for when the legislature returns. I think that will be first and foremost an issue that they need to grapple with. I will say that the court rule about sort of what happens in court with evictions is in effect until, I'm drawing a blank, but sometime after the state of emergency ends.
Yeah, I think it's 60 or 90 days. It's a good amount of time.
I believe it's 90. And so the sort of best, protections that we've seen passed at the local level sort of mirror that in terms of recognizing the hardship in terms of housing will last far longer than the actual pandemic, right? People's incomes have been hurt, and it's going to take them a while to catch up, and they should not be expected to just pay all of that back rent in one lump sum, just as Lisa was talking about with the mortgage payments. So the reality is, as I said earlier, nothing has relieved people of the obligation to pay that rent. People should work with their landlords where they're able to, and landlords should work with their tenants in recognition of the fact that there may not be the next tenant to move in, and really try to be compassionate and recognize the sort of scale of the need here. It will be incumbent on our policymakers to really figure out that next step in terms of protecting people from getting displaced based on that debt. Most debt you can't be kicked out of your home for, and we should be thinking along those lines here as well. But also, providing whatever assistance and support we can, both to renters and landlords, to sort of help reduce the hit that is taken.
And very quickly, it may vary from local jurisdiction to local jurisdiction in terms of how much time you may have to pay back rent. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Sasha.
That's right. Some jurisdictions sort of haven't dealt with this question at all. Some have sort of required payment plans and things like that. So the most important thing is just to check the local protections in your city, see whether they apply to you and what you need to do to take advantage of those.
For example, LA is giving you 12 months right now to repay any missed rent payments. So we are coming up on the end of our hour-long Coronavirus Explained webinar. I just wanted to leave it up to our guests if there was one thing you wanted to impart to some of the people that you advocate on behalf of. What would that be? What would be your kind of closing statement to, let's start with you, Lisa, homeowners who are worried about what's the next 3 months, 6 months, year is going to look like?
I would say that there is assistance available if you need it. It's going to take some work and time to get it. So there's a certain amount of patience and maybe a little bit of meditating before you try to call your loan servicer maybe in order, because they are absolutely overwhelmed. I was looking a moment ago at the statistics. I mean, there are about 6% of all loans now in the country are in forbearance. And on March 2nd, that was 0.25%. So it's been an exponential leap up. And those numbers, I should say, are a lot higher for the pools of loans that are for the lowest income homeowners, and often the kinds of loans that are given in communities of color. So we know it's no surprise, but that those are the people who are being impacted the most. One final just piece of advice I would say is that it's very important as you're interacting with your loan servicer to take careful notes. If you're submitting documents or giving information, keep track of that, keep copies, keep proof of what you've turned in, because as I said, there is going to be another kind of whole communication and negotiation at the back end of all of this, and having a really clear record of what you were told and what you told them and what happened is going to be important to make that as smooth as it can possibly be, so that you can get back current and move forward.
So maybe emails instead of waiting on hold for forever. Tomiquia, same question. Is there one kind of parting thought you have for people who are homeless or want to help people who are homeless?
Well, I guess my parting comment would be that, it's important as we move through this emergency right now is to continue to do this work with the same sense of urgency in terms of figuring out how we bring our unsheltered neighbors indoors and how we actually lead with a racial equity lens on this work. We know that our folks who were vulnerable, either extremely low income households or people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, were already disproportionately impacted by both the health impacts of poverty and disproportionately impacted by race. And so I think it's going to be really important as we move forward for Californians to keep that front and center as they engage around this issue and work with their policymakers and community members around how do we make sure that not only are the emergency supports that people want to provide, which are critically important, actually leave way for structural reform to some of these issues so that we can shift the paradigm around how we weather the next crisis.
And Sasha?
So I really appreciate that comment from Tomiquia. I think, as we work to solve this crisis, we also have an opportunity to sort of work to advance racial justice and rectify a long history of structural racism built into our federal and state housing policies. In terms of sort of parting words for tenants, I would say, do what you can to work with your landlord. And we recognize that this is a really scary and tough time for millions of people. Just know that sort of really scary threat of being removed from your home after a court eviction is currently on pause, and there is time to seek out help, to seek out legal advice. Once you've notified your landlord and done what you can there, I think the next step is just to sort of find out what protections apply to you, stay calm, and know that if you get a 3-day notice to pay or quit, which you might, that is the beginning, that is not the end of the process. And so people should not be sort of scared or bullied out of their homes right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our guests for joining us. You guys were fantastic. I want to thank everybody who watched and asked questions, including those who submitted some of your questions in advance. They were very good questions. If you missed any of this, it will live in perpetuity on our YouTube page, also at CalMatters.org. It is also available on all the podcast platforms that I mentioned earlier. I will also run it on my own podcast, another CalMatters podcast, Gimme Shelter, the California Housing Crisis podcast. If you're interested, I recommend you subscribe to that if you like the dulcet tones of my voice. For all of the California-specific coverage of the coronavirus outbreak here, subscribe to our newsletter at calmatters.org. Visit us at calmatters.org/coronavirus. And again, if you can afford it, please make a donation at this time and support your local newspaper. Thanks again to our guests, and thank you all for listening and watching.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our guests, and thank you all for listening and watching.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.